Now in our 26th year, more than a quarter of a century of service to the worldwide amateur radio community, we are This Week in Amateur Radio, your all-amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. This is edition number 1364 with a release and air date of Saturday, April 19, 2025. Please take the program to your air following the cue tone.
Heard every week on the amateur radio bands all around the world, broadcast on low-power AM and FM stations across the country, and podcast on the internet since 1993, we are This Week in Amateur Radio, the worldwide premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Here are the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1364, our World Amateur Radio Weekend edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. The ARRL files comments responding to the FCC request for input on its delete notice of proposed rulemaking. We will have an exclusive in-depth look at the filing. World Amateur Radio Day honors the formation of the International Amateur Radio Union 100 years ago. The International Amateur Radio Union places amateur radio at the forefront. The League documents the next generation of DXing during its program at the 2025 International DX Convention. The Australian Communications and Media Authority seeks comments on its proposed class licensing conditions. The FCC considers letting Starlink increase its satellite's transmission power. The Radio Amateurs of Canada announces it will not attend the 2025 Dayton Hamvention. The FCC grants construction permits for 3 new high-power shortwave stations in the United States. The Radio Amateurs of Canada announce a program to save the original Marconi transmission towers. The annual Armed Forces Day cross-band test is coming up, we will have the details. And, Florida Trail Events take ham radio along for the journey. We will tell you all about it in this week's special expanded edition. These headline stories will come to you in a moment, along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all those amateur satellites in orbit. Australia's own Onno Benschop, VK6FLAB, and Foundations of Amateur Radio will tell us all how to play games on the air on amateur radio. Our own amateur radio historian, Will Rogers, K5WLR, returns with part 2 of a brand new edition of A Century of Amateur Radio. This week, Will takes us aboard the Wayback Machine to the mid-1920s to witness amateurs continuing their efforts to get their signals across the Atlantic in an episode called Crossing 2, Androsen. We will stop by and visit with Bill Saliers, AJ8B, in the DX Corner, with all the latest news on DXpeditions, DX, upcoming radio sport contests, and more. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters, in the air chair in Studio A, this is W2XBS.
And reporting this week from our news bureau in Cortlandville, New York, I'm Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
Reporting from our news bureau in Salem, Ohio, this is Denny Haight, NZ8D.
And from sunny, beautiful Naugatuck, Connecticut, where the sun always shines, I'm Steve Sawyer, K1FRC.
Reporting live from the warm and humid Space Coast in Florida, I am Ed Johnson, W2PH.
Reporting from our news bureau in Lebanon, Tennessee, where the temperature will be in the 80s all weekend, I'm Al Shephard, WK8W.
And reporting from our news bureau in Knoxville, Tennessee, where we are wishing you a very happy Easter and a happy Passover, I'm Josh Marler, AA4WX.
And reporting from our True New York News Bureau, where these April showers keep developing into snow squalls, I'm Eric, Kilo Delta 2, Romeo Juliet X-Ray.
And reporting from our amateur radio outpost in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, where there's still a trace of snow on the ground, even though it was 60 degrees today. I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And reporting from our somewhat soggy news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, formerly known as the American Radio Relay League, Incorporated, submits these comments in response to the public notice released on March 12, 2025, in regards to delete. By this public notice, the Commission sought public input on alleviating unnecessary regulatory burdens. As set forth below, the ARRL requests that the Commission initiate an omnibus proceeding to modernize specific sections of its Part 97 rules that regulate the amateur radio service. Several of the proposals addressed below already are pending before the Commission and are at various rulemaking stages with initial comment periods completed. Other proposals are new. Adopting the proposals identified below would remove unnecessary regulatory burdens by modernizing, clarifying, or deleting specific outdated rules that govern the amateur radio service. The amateur radio service is unique in that its purpose is to encourage self-training, communication, and technical investigation by persons interested in radio techniques solely within personal aims and without pecuniary interest. The Commission and like regulatory authorities around the world long have recognized the enduring public interest in the amateur radio service as a voluntary, non-commercial communication service and the amateur's proven ability to contribute to the advancement of the radio art, to expanding the reservoir of trained wireless operators, technicians, and electronics experts, and in facilitating the amateur's unique ability to enhance international goodwill. Amateurs also are well respected, providing essential communication links and facilitating relief actions when normal communications infrastructure is disrupted. The Commission is regularly called upon to review and adjust its regulations in its regulated service as practices change and new technologies supplement and replace traditional technologies. The amateur radio service has the same necessity for its rules to keep up with today's fast-paced technological changes and welcomes this opportunity to make suggestions on modernizing Part 97 rules. Today in the amateur service, many radios are run solely or principally by software. The soldering iron and discrete physical components used in past experiments often are replaced by a personal computer and coding knowledge to experiment with new techniques and functions. While limited rule changes have been made in the past to accommodate these changes within the service, there remain rules and policies that hamper modern wireless education and experimentation by amateurs. Such rules require deletion or modification to better accommodate and encourage a new generation of wireless experts while still accommodating traditional technologies and techniques. By the proposals discussed below, we seek modest changes aimed at modernizing and increasing the flexibility of certain Part 97 rules to remove barriers and accommodate new modes and techniques, especially with regard to new digital modes that by and large did not exist when most of the current rules were formulated. We propose to do this while preserving the basis for traditional modes and techniques that continue to form a significant basis for the service. Now, to begin our close-up look at the League filing, we go to our own Denny Haight, NZ8D.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
Delete symbol or baud rate and bandwidth limitations, WT docket number 16-239. In November of 2023, the Commission adopted a further notice of proposed rulemaking in which it proposed to remove the symbol or baud rate and bandwidth limits on specific amateur LF and VHF/UHF bands. As set forth in its comments and reply comments, ARRL supports the deletion of these unnecessary restrictions as proposed by the Commission because these limitations encumber amateur experimentation with new modes and techniques without countervailing benefits. The comments filed indicate unanimous support for deleting the symbol or baud rate as the Commission proposed. The vast majority of commenters also supported deleting bandwidth limits. Given that the comment cycle on this was completed over a year ago, we request the Commission act without further delay to adopt the rule changes as proposed. Update and modernize entry-level technician class license privileges, RM-11828. It has been many years since the privileges of the amateur radio entry-level license have been updated. During this period, digital technologies and modes have been introduced and become widely popular in the amateur radio service. Yet the newest entrants are denied access to the HF frequencies where these modes are employed. Limited access to these frequencies is essential to provide a window to the wonder of worldwide low-power communications. The reason for their absence simply is because entry-level privileges were adopted before the digital techniques existed that have become popular and now are widely used throughout the world. The changes that ARRL proposed in this petition would measurably assist in attracting youth to the STEM subjects that are at the core of amateur radio self-training, developing improved operating capabilities, and increasing emergency communications capabilities. The youth attracted to amateur radio today will become the wireless engineers and space scientists of tomorrow that are critical to our nation's future if given a chance. Specifically, in February of 2018, ARRL filed a petition to modernize and update the privileges accorded to technician class licensees with the goal of attracting new youth to the STEM subjects that are at the core of the amateur radio experience. The proposed changes would permit the technician class licensees to use the new digital data transmission techniques on limited slices of desirable HF bands. The comment period was completed, but no further action has been taken. The requested rule changes are modest. The ARRL evaluated efforts to attract and retain amateur licensees. The results demonstrated that the increasingly rapid pace of change in communications technologies, coupled with the national need for self-training in science, technology, engineering, and math, core STEM subjects, require adding privileges to the entry-level amateur radio class to reflect the burgeoning interest in digital technologies and social interaction. The interests of young STEM candidates understandably lean towards digital technologies and the accompanying computer programming aspects. This is what they grow up learning, and this is where developing knowledge and expertise is most likely to lead to good job opportunities, public service, and development of future innovations and services. These purposes are at the core of amateur radio as set forth in the Commission rules, yet roughly one-half of the amateur population cannot participate in the promise and opportunities presented on the frequencies of interest. The recognition that technician is the entry level and that entrants have a wide variety of interests that are not being met by the outdated restrictions on technician class privileges, ARRL proposed to add limited digital and voice privileges on frequencies below 30 MHz where distant communications are possible. The petition set out a balanced approach that retains substantial incentives for technician class licensees to improve their knowledge and skills to gain additional privileges by successfully passing the more difficult general and extra class examinations. At the same time, these changes would allow new entrants to experience the possibilities inherent in worldwide digital and voice communications and emergency event training in a practical manner. We therefore renew our request for consideration of the changes proposed in RM-11828. Modernize 80/75 meter subband divisions, RM-11759. The widespread adoption of digital modes in the amateur service has resulted in a deteriorating imbalance in the portion of the amateur 80 and 75 meter subbands. Multiple stations are crowded into a thin sliver in one area, while otherwise usable frequencies nearby are underutilized because the subband limits drawn years ago are based on usage patterns that are now significantly changed. Recognizing the needless interference and inefficiency in spectrum use, in 2016 the ARRL petitioned the Commission to adjust the boundaries to better accommodate the greater demand for new digital modes and thereby improve efficient use of the allocated spectrum. In its petition, the ARRL requested that the lower edge of the phone band, 3.600 MHz, be shifted to 3.650 MHz, that RTTY and data be permitted in the 3.5 to 3.65 MHz subband, that the ACDS subband be shifted upwards to 3.6 to 3.615 MHz to correspond with international uses and voluntary band plans, that grandfathered novice and all technician class licensees be authorized CW, RIDI, and data modes in the 3.600 to 3.650 MHz segment, and that general and advanced class licensees also be granted access to the 3.600 to 3.650 MHz segment. This realignment is long overdue. While space in these bands will continue to be in high demand and short supply, the proposed realignment would alleviate some of the congestion and better match today's usage patterns. We recently reviewed these proposals and found that they are needed more now than ever. We therefore renew our request for consideration of the changes proposed in RM-11759. To continue our look at the filing and its proposed changes, we go back to our own Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
Section 97.309 dates to the dawn of the digital age. The limitations in subsection A, paragraph 1 to paragraph 3 are obsolete and should be deleted and replaced with provisions based upon Section 97.309, subpart A, paragraph 4, and Section 97.309, subpart B. Doing so would better reflect the current reality of data communications and encourage, rather than prohibit, new experimentation by radio amateurs. We request that the Commission delete the limitations identified above and instead permit radio amateurs to experiment freely with new digital codes so long as such codes are publicly documented and decoded over the air. Doing so would remove provisions that refer to digital codes that today are obsolete and permit the use of new digital codes as they are being created. This is the reality of the digital world today, requiring that amateurs use only digital codes that are unencrypted and readily receivable by others reasonably skilled in the art would preserve the core objectives of the now outmoded limitations. In addition, the intended application of Section 97.309, subpart B, is puzzling, insofar as it provides that amateurs can only use certain digital codes to communicate with amateurs in other countries if the United States has an agreement with the other countries permitting use of the code. This provision has proven unworkable in practice. Neither the United States nor any other country is known to have entered into any such agreements, nor is such a requirement addressed in the ITU radio regulations. In practice, insofar as we can determine, other countries freely permit their radio amateurs to experiment with digital codes so long as they are not encrypted, are readily receivable by others reasonably skilled in the art, and are used for purposes free of any pecuniary interest. Therefore, this provision should be deleted entirely from any revisions as proposed above. Finally, the obsolete limiting of subbands to only phone and image, or RIDI, and data emissions in Section 97.305, 97.307, and 97.119 subpart B should be reworked to be compatible with today's digital reality. For example, with earlier transmission modes, there is a clear distinction between voice and data. That barrier is obsolete with digital modes. The same digital signal may carry voice, data, images, or any combination thereof. The current rules lead to confusion about where it's permissible to transmit a digital data signal carrying both voice and data, or whether a digital data signal carrying only voice, such as free DV, a digital voice mode, should be transmitted in the phone or in the data subbands. The confusion itself hampers experimentation with exciting new digital modes. At the 2003 World Radio Conference in 2003, Article 25 of the International Radio Regulations that governs the radio amateur service was updated and modernized. With the support of the FCC and the United States delegation to WRCO3, a rule was deleted that dated back to 1932 that had prohibited third-party communications unless the amateur's country had agreed otherwise. In practice, the 1932 provision had required the conclusion of a formal bilateral treaty with each country willing to have its radio amateurs engage in third-party messages. The FCC WRC-03 Advisory Committee, the U.S. delegation at the conference, and the Amateurs International Amateur Radio Union all supported entirely deleting the third-party prohibition. However, compromise at the conference resulted in a replacement provision being adopted, ITU RR 25.3, that reads, "Amateur stations may be used for transmitting international communications on behalf of third parties only in case of emergencies or disaster relief. An administration may determine the applicability of these provisions to amateur stations under its jurisdiction. This new provision established a right to engage in third-party communications in cases of emergencies and disaster relief, and also eliminated the requirement for formal bilateral agreements for times outside such events." The head delegation, in their report submitted to the Secretary of State after the WRC-03 conference, explained that this should eliminate or greatly reduce the need for third-party agreements between countries. In an article published shortly thereafter in QST, the monthly journal of the ARRL, an amateur that had represented the IARU on this issue at the conference explained further that bilateral agreements are no longer required in order for international third-party messages to be permitted. Notwithstanding this change to the ITU-RR Treaty, Section 97.115, Subpart A, Paragraph 2, continues to require third-party agreements negotiated by the State Department with their counterpart foreign ministries in order for radio amateurs in the United States to exchange third-party messages with their cohorts in other countries. However, given the change in the ITU regulations, other countries have no need to enter into negotiations for such agreements in order to permit their amateurs to handle international third-party messages, and no new agreements have been concluded since adoption of the new provisions at WRC-03. The continued requirement that remains in the FCC rules for third-party agreements inhibits amateurs' experimentation and cross-border training for emergency messages handling for when it may be needed. It is unclear why this provision remains in the rules after the changes effectuated at WRC-03. It is time to implement the change adopted 2 decades ago at WRC-03 and delete the treaty requirement in Part 95.115A2. This would permit and encourage cross-border communication training and operation. Now, with the conclusion of our in-depth look at the League filing, we go back to our own Denny Haight, NZ8D.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Delete amplifier drive limitations, RM-11767. Over the last 20 years, solid-state LDMOS devices, laterally diffused metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors, have become a common replacement for vacuum tubes in high-power amateur radio RF amplifiers. These devices provide efficient and reliable performance and are capable of higher ratios of power amplification than the tubes they replace. While tubes typically provided enough power amplification for a 50 to 100 watt transmitter to be increased to the 1500 watt limit permissible in amateur service, the new solid-state devices are capable of amplifying even a 1 to a 25 watt transmitter to the legal 1500 watt maximum. The increased power gain increases power efficiency. It also allows for smaller and less expensive 5-watt transceivers to be boosted to the legal maximum 1500 watts without need for an intermediate amplifier. Expert Linears America, LLC, petitioned the Commission to eliminate the restriction in Section 97.317, Subpart A, Paragraph 2, that limits HF amplifier gain to 15 dB. This restriction, originally adopted in the 1970s, was intended to prevent CBers from using amateur amplifiers with 5-watt radios. That purpose no longer is pertinent, but the rule, now an artifact of times past, remains and restricts innovation in and efficiency of amateur radio equipment as well as increases the cost of amateur equipment. ARRL supports deleting this restriction. There is no comparable gain limit in any other country that we know of, and amateurs everywhere except the United States can make full use of the new, more efficient amplifier technology. U.S. radio amateurs also should be permitted to do so. Remove non-current personal information in amateur ULS records, WT docket number 15-81. In 2015, the Commission proposed removing from public view on its ULS website non-current licensing and application information. The intent was to protect the privacy of amateur and possibly other individual applicants, since home addresses are often used by these applicants when initially submitting their applications. As the Commission pointed out in its proposal as an example, although a licensee coming under personal threat might change their FCC address to a post office box, the original address and related information still remains visible to the public in the FCC's ULS system. We request that the Commission adopt this proposal so that those who wish can update their contact information in ULS and thereby protect their privacy. As it is, this personal information seems to remain publicly available forever, and certainly far beyond the time when there is any need. Delete obsolete identification requirement for special call signs. The last sentence of Section 97.119, Subpart B, requires operators using a special event call sign to identify using their assigned call sign at least once per hour during such activities. This rule was adopted in the 1990s before the widespread public availability of an online database that clearly identifies each special event call sign by reference to the FCC authorized call sign and dates for which the special call sign is authorized for use by the identified licensee. Deleting the last sentence of Section 97.119 Subpart B will facilitate instant proper identification of the licensee responsible for the signal without the confusion that can be caused when the alternative call sign is transmitted hourly, especially when using digital and CW modes. Delete obsolete paper license replacement provision. Effective December 30, 2020, the Commission ceased mailing paper licenses to amateur radio licensees. However, Section 97.29 was not confirmed and still provides for an application to be submitted to replace a physical license document. Today, originals of FCC Part 97 licenses are obtained using the FCC's password-protected portion of ULS with the licensee specified FRN and password. Section 97.29 therefore should be deleted as obsolete. In conclusion, for the reasons stated above, the ARRL respectfully requests that the Commission proceed to act on the above matters. Technology has changed dramatically in the amateur radio domain, as it has in most other communication services, and the above requested rules, deletions, and modifications will foster the regulatory goals for the amateur service and continue to increase the amateur's historical experimentation and service in meaningful ways. Respectfully submitted, ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio.
April 18th is honored as World Amateur Radio Day, when we celebrate the founding of the International Amateur Radio Union, or IARU. To tell us more, we go to John Ross, KD8IDJ, at League headquarters with the rest of the story.
The organization was born out of a meeting in Paris on April 17, 1925. ARRL took a leadership role in its founding, with ARRL founder Ira Percy Maxim, then 1AW, serving as the first president of the IARU. As reported by Kenneth B. Warner, 1BHW, in the June 1925 edition of QST, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Dream of Years, came into existence on April 17, 1925, when the delegates of 23 nations met in Paris for the first time and for the first International Amateur Radio Congress. The union has adopted a constitution, its officers have been elected, and 4 national sections have been formed and recognized. And the excitement of an international body to serve the interest of all radio amateurs was thrilling to hams at that time, Warner said. 100 years later, amateur radio looks a lot different than it would have to the delegates in Paris, but the international goodwill, thrill of two-way contacts with other countries, and history of technological innovation continues. ARRL remains the International Secretariat of the IARU, and the work of the IARU remains important to the future of this global advocation that shrinks the world. I'm John Ross, KD8I-DJ.
The following is additional material as reported by Keith Warner, 1BHW, in the June 1925 edition of QST. Its objects lie along lines that will promote and coordinate two-way radio communication between the amateurs of the various countries of the world. Membership is by individuals, and anyone interested in the objects of the Union can become a member. In each country from which there are 25 or more members, is there to be a national section, like divisions of the ARRL, each with its national president, and these national presidents with the executive committee constitute the board of directors of the Union. Our ARRL president, Mr. Hiram Percy Maxim, 1AW, was elected international president. 23 nations. This subcommittee elected Mr. Maxim as chairman and Mr. John G. Metzger, F8GO, secretary, and started work. By its second session, it has agreed unanimously that there should be a union, that it should be organized by individual memberships, that it should have its chief purpose the coordination and fostering of international amateur radio two-way communications.
At its meeting on March 27, 2025, the Board of Directors of Radio Amateurs of Canada voted unanimously to cancel RAC's plans to operate a booth at Hamvention, better known as Dayton, in Xenia, Ohio, in May. The decision was announced in a release from RAC President Alan Boyd, Victor Echo 3, Alpha Juliet Bravo, Victor Echo 3, Echo Mike. He went on to say that this decision was not taken lightly and was made with deep regret, as our members and volunteers always look forward to attending this significant international event. The relationship between Canada and the United States has become increasingly strained due to recent trade disputes and tariffs imposed by the U.S. government. Adding to those challenges, controversial remarks from U.S. leaders, including suggestions of Canada becoming the 51st state, have heightened concerns about Canadian sovereignty. For Canadians, these tensions have had tangible impacts, and there's been a decline in cross-border travel and tourism. It is a complex and evolving situation, but it is our hope that we'll be able to return to Hamvention in future years, and we hope that Canadian amateurs who do attend the event will have a safe and enjoyable experience.
Keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. Available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
World Amateur Radio Day is when we, the member societies of the International Amateur Radio Union, can show our capabilities to the public. For this centennial year, we've dedicated the day to entering the next century of amateur radio, communications, and innovation. For the last 100 years, the IARU has worked tirelessly to promote innovation in the field and to encourage the growth of amateur radio. From the early years, we've safeguarded radio frequencies for amateur service and coordinated with other amateur radio spectrum users throughout the ITU, better known as the International Telecommunications Union. By 1932, the new amateur union was admitted to the Consultative Committee on International Radio, the forerunner of today's ITU radio communications sector. Today we remain an active member participating in ITU's World Radio Communications, World Telecommunications Development, and the Plenipotentiary Conference, as well as its Telecommunications Development Advisory Group and other radio communications and development meetings. Over the decades, we've relied on volunteers to represent the IARU and amateur service. Active engagement at ITU and regional telecommunications organizations is achieved entirely through the dedication of amateur radio operators who volunteer their time, efforts, and unique skill set. The IARU has been pleased to work with ITU's Telecommunications Development Center on initiatives like Smart Sustainable Development Model, training programs for regulatory staff, and numerous global emergency communication workshops. Countless times, amateur radio services have provided vital emergency communication during disasters. Often in the first 24 to 48 hours of an event, amateur radio is the only means of communication. Radio amateurs have their own equipment, their own networks, and the skills to utilize basic materials for adequate communications to and from a stricken area. Amateur radio remains critical for times of crisis. Through ITU coordination, the IARU has obtained key spectrum allocations for amateur service, including a global 21 MHz band starting in 1947 and 10, 18, and 24 MHz allocations in 1979. In 2003, they achieved an extension of amateur 7 MHz band and easing of Article 25.4 to facilitate disaster communications in 2003. Their more recent communications milestones include added allocations at 136 kHz in 2007 and 472 kHz in 2012, a small allocation at 5 MHz in 2015, and coexistence of the secondary amateur and amateur satellite allocations within radio navigation satellite service in the range of 1240 through 1300 MHz, decided in 2023. Amateurs have made strides in digital communications. New digital modes will continue to emerge. They're at the forefront of satellite communications, with many schools and universities building pocket-sized CubeSats that utilize amateur satellite frequencies, an educational spectrum that we're pleased to coordinate on ITU's behalf. Amateur operators are also making progress above 144 MHz for Earth, Moon, Earth, and other communications, as well as experiments with allocated microwave frequencies at 1.2 GHz or higher. With these exciting new applications, amateur radio is enjoying a renaissance among younger people. We're excited by the prospect of future decades of success. As we enter our second century, we look forward to further projects and partnerships with ITU. We're proud to protect key services, enhance amateur radio, and help optimize the radio spectrum for the use and good of all.
The FCC granted 2 new construction permits, or CPs, and 1 new license in the high-frequency international broadcast band, known to most as the shortwave band, to U.S. operators. The 2 CPs granted in Illinois to DPA-MAC, based in San Francisco, and Parable Broadcasting, based in Virginia, were partial in nature. These operators received grants for traditional international band broadcasting under Part 73 of the FCC rules, but the applicants were denied their desire for data casting or non-broadcast point-to-point transmissions. Multiple objections had been filed with the Commission against the 2 applications. They questioned how such data transmissions could be received by the general public, as such licenses are intended. We find that a partial grant of the application is in the public interest, as it would enable the general public in foreign countries to directly receive programming, the Commission wrote in its CP grant to Parable Broadcasting. Parable was granted the call sign WPBA. A group called the High Frequency Parties had filed an objection with the FCC regarding the Parable application. Persons wishing to conduct commercial HF point-to-point messaging for third parties should do so in a radio service dedicated to that function, they wrote in their objection, and if none exists, they should petition the FCC to create or reinstate such a service. The Commission concurred. Such encoded data would render the transmitted signal incapable of being received by the general public in other countries and not enjoyable as an international broadcast service, it wrote in granting the 2 permits. Parable Broadcasting had filed for a construction permit in April 2020 for the station from Batavia, Illinois, while DPA-MAC filed in December of that year for one in Maple Park, Illinois. Both communities are within 50 miles of Chicago, west of the city. The third station, granted call sign WIPE and filed by Terms Tech, which is based in New York City, is farther along. It has been granted a license as opposed to a construction permit as of January of this year. Terms 2 filed for its application in 2020. All three applicants wish to use the Digital Radio Mondial or DRM standard. The Shortwave Modernization Coalition filed a petition in 2023 to amend existing FCC rules to allow distance non-voice communications between 2 and 25 megahertz. The SMC petition goes on to explain how frequencies in the under-licensed band are the optimal medium for fixed, long-distance transmissions of time-sensitive data. Amateur radio operators raise concerns of interference produced by an HF band full of financial traders. The ARRL has already made its feeling against the service known. Cobb mentioned that operators already are familiar with unidentified high-power transmissions detected in or adjacent to the amateur radio bands. The U.S. Coast Guard also placed concerns of interference in the 2 to 25 megahertz band. These stations have proposed using digital modulation with 50 kilohertz bandwidths and 20,000 watts of power. Much would need to transpire to produce a shortwave reawakening, but the outcomes of these three grants will have quite a few people watching.
The 76th International DX Convention was held in Visalia, California from April 11th through the 13th. With all the details on the conference, we go to our field reporter, John Ross, KD8IDJ, with this report.
A major focus of this year's conference was the future of DXpeditions. A full day of informative presentations was focused on the next generation DXing program. ARRL was there to engage with members and document the sessions on video. The first of many next-gen DX presentations is available now on the ARRL HQ YouTube channel. The playlist will be built out in the coming days with the rest of the material. Even if you never plan to go on a DXpedition, the information in these sessions will give you a deep dive insight into what goes on into making one of these far-flung activities and activations happen. The panelists hope that some may even be inspired to enter the world of operating from rare entities. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
Session 1 focuses on mission planning. The forum is moderated by noted DXer Ned Stearns, AA7A, who also serves as ARRL Vice Director for the Southwestern Division. The panel also includes George Wallner, AA7JV, Don Greenbaum, N1DG, and ARRL Radio Sport and Regulatory Affairs Manager Bart Jank, W9JJ. Each of the four experts share their perspective on the current state of DXpeditions and what evolving technology and regulatory situations mean for the future.
You are listening to North America's premier news and information service for the amateur radio hobbyist. We are This Week in Amateur Radio.
In Australia, the communications regulator is looking for input on some minor changes in language affecting the nation's new amateur class license. The Radio Communications License Conditions Determination 2015, which provides conditions on the use of amateur radio assigned and non-assigned licenses, is being reviewed by the Australian Communications and Media Authority before it expires on October 1st, 2025. While many amateurs now operate under the Radio Communications Class License 2023, existing non-assigned amateur licenses will continue to exist and operate under the conditions of the 2015 Amateur License Conditions Determination until they expire. The authority's goal is to fine-tune the language of the License Conditions Determination so it aligns with the new amateur class license. Although the Australian Communications and Media Authority is seeking comments from the public, the authority stresses that this review is not considering major changes, such as amateur access to bands, but a list of simple recommendations that are now available for viewing in draft form. Comments are due no later than Monday the 26th of May at 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.
If you are a high school student or even younger, the easiest way to attend this year's Hamvention is to simply show up on Saturday, May 17th at the Greene County Fair and Expo Center. Admission is free that day for youngsters. Young visitors who want an experience that's designed just for them are also able to attend the Youth Rally, a special day-long program designed to offer students a variety of hands-on experiences in amateur radio. It is led by Steve Goodgame, Kilo 5, Alpha Tango Alpha, the ARRL's Education and Learning Manager. Students get to take part in a short on-air sprint, contact a parachute mobile radio operator, and learn about satellite communications. Youngsters are encouraged to bring a 2-meter handheld if they have one. Unlike admission to the fairgrounds, advanced registration is recommended for the Youth Rally and costs $20.
The annual Armed Forces Day Crossband Test, hosted by the Department of Defense, is scheduled for Saturday, May 10th of 2025. The event will test two-way communications between military stations and amateur radio operators, as authorized by the Federal Communications Commission in Title 47 of the Code, Federal Regulations 47 CFR 97.111. The tests provide opportunities and challenges for operators to test their individual technical skills in a controlled scenario that will not impact public or private communications. The annual Department of Defense message will be transmitted via RTTY on 14.667 kilohertz at 1400 and 2000 UTC. Military stations will transmit on the selected military frequencies and announce the specific amateur radio service frequencies that will be monitored. All scheduled times are in UTC, and all scheduled frequencies will be upper sideband unless otherwise noted. For more than 50 years, military and amateur stations have taken part in this event. Information on frequencies, times, and other technical information can be found at DoD Mars Armed Forces Day. A QSL card will be available in May after the test at www.usarmymars.org/home.
Former ARRL Vice Director and Contest Advisory Committee Chairman Wayne Overbeck, Ph.D., N6NB, passed away on April 12, 2025. He was 82 years old. Overbeck held an amateur extra class license and was active in amateur radio for over 68 years. He served 4 terms as Vice Director for the ARRL Southwestern Division from 1984 to 1993 and was Chairman of the ARRL Contest Advisory Committee during the 1970s, as well as an ARRL Life member. Marty Wohl, N6VI, also a past Vice Director, has known and operated with Overbeck for over 40 years. As K6YNB, he began mountain hopping on both the west and east coasts in a camper truck outfitted with radios, antennas, and amplifiers he called Cab Over Kilowatt, and by 1980 had a dozen national first-place finishes in VHF Plus contests, setting scoring records that were never broken under the pre-grid scoring system, said Wall. Overbeck received the ARRL Technical Excellence Award in 1977. He received the John Chambers Memorial Award from the Central States VHF Society twice, first in 1978 and again in 2015. He was honored as Radio Amateur of the Year at the Dayton Hamvention in 1980. Overbeck was an accomplished journalist, communications law professor, lawyer, real estate broker, 20-year author of a widely adopted textbook, pilot, sailor, cabin builder, computer programmer, and amateur radio engineer. More details about his life and career can be found on his Facebook page.
There's an effort underway to save some of Marconi's original towers, and an online poll is open for people to vote on it being a restoration project through the next Great Save project from the National Trust for Canada. Some of Marconi's first messages were received and transmitted using the Battle Harbor Marconi Towers, thought to be the last of their kind standing in North America. News of Admiral Robert Peary's 1909 North Pole expedition was transmitted by these towers. After 100 years, the twin towers are in need of repair. To honor 150 years since Marconi's birth, there are a number of events planned around the world to observe Marconi's birthday and International Marconi Day. In the United States, from the port of Baltimore, Maryland, the nuclear ship Savannah Amateur Radio Club will operate Kilo 3 Sierra on April 26th from 1330 to 2100 UTC. Check spotting networks for frequency. Finally, the Great South Bay Amateur Radio Club in Babylon, New York will operate Whiskey 2 Golf Sierra Bravo from the Babylon Village Historical Society Museum for Marconi Day on April 26th from 1300 to 2030 UTC. Frequencies include 28.340, 21.250, 14.246, and 7.245 megahertz.
It is our unhappy duty to report Paul Tad Cook, K7RA, passed away on April 13th, 2025. For 36 years, Cook wrote the weekly W1AW propagation forecast bulletin and the K7RA solar update for the ARRL letter. He retired in January 2025, citing a recent ALS diagnosis, and on March 8th, Cook received the ARRL President's Award presented to him by the ARRL Northwestern Division Director Mark Tharp, KB7HDX. Several weeks ago, Robin Amundsen, WA7 CPA, and Western Washington DX Club President Rob Fanfant, N7QT, sat down with Cook to talk about his life and amateur radio, and he shared several interesting stories. One of his fun ham experiences was road tripping the western United States in a 5-speed stick shift while making CWQSOs on his Drake TR7 radio and logging on a legal pad, with ham sticks for antennas on the top of his car. About 15 years ago, Tad discovered a dance subculture on Capitol Hill in Seattle, getting hooked on traditional blues dancing. He danced at the Capitol Hill Dance Underground and Waves, a Haitian restaurant. He danced with every woman featured on a public broadcasting service All Things Considered segment on Blues Dance, including the host. Tad also played the guitar in Danny Esconzi's K7SS Lamar Harrington Band. Their 1975 single Kaka Mau Mau is still available for sale. In addition, Tad worked as a roadie for one of the most iconic rock bands of that generation, Iron Butterfly. Cook admitted he led a life of calculated risks, fueled by deep personal conviction and a desire to make the world a better place. Funeral arrangements are pending and will be announced at a later date. Watch for the full story in an upcoming issue of QST Magazine.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
Hello and welcome to the DX Corner for your weekly dose of DX as part of Ham Radio's oldest ham radio magazine on the air, This Week in Amateur Radio. I'm Bill, AJ8B. If you're watching this on YouTube, the text of this will be included in the show notes. If you've been with me for the past several weeks, you will know that I'm trying to focus on those entities that will be available in the next week. There's so much data to sift through that I thought a focus on the next 7 days might be helpful. The following DX information comes from Bernie, W3UR, editor of the Daily DX, the Weekly DX, and the How's DX column in QST. If you would like a free 2-week trial of the Daily DX, your only source of real-time DX information, just drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com and I'll make it happen. Here's what should be on in the next coming week. An activation in Botswana by Luke, ZS6LUK, is underway. His QRV is 825 LUK through the end of April. He will be using an IC7706, so he can be on 40, 30, 20, and 10 meters. His modes will be single sideband plus some FT8. Some of his planned destinations are registered parks in the POTA program or the Parks on the Air program, and he will put his logs on QRZ.com. 3 Delta 2 Bravo Papa is the new call sign for KD6XU, Barry, and Fiji. He will be on 80 through 10 meters, mostly CW, but some FT8 and sideband. His operating hours are sporadic, in his words, kind of a hit or miss kind of a thing, end quote. He has an ICOM IC7300, a Yaesu FT891, and a QRP Labs QMX-MID. He plans to do some POTA activations like he did in Samoa, but this time he has the FT891, so it will not be all QRP CW. Most of Barry's operations will be from land, but occasionally he may be on his yacht if a beach is not available in the park he is at or near. QSL using LOTW, paper QSLs are not an option. And if you work Barry for DXCC credit or for a band slot, make sure he's not on his yacht because it won't count. In February, PC4K, David, a missionary engineer, relocated to Manzini, Eswatini. He has been issued the call sign 3 Delta Alpha 0 Papa Alpha and will be active with an ICOM IC705 at 10 watts and a Soda Beams inverted V dipole for 40 and 20 meters. It is tunable on other bands, so you may catch him there. He has signed up for an LOTW account. VK4 MAP Darren has been QRV since April 8th as H44DX on 10 meter single sideband, typically hanging around between 28.460 and 28.465 MHz. He will be portable from Malaysia Island during this time. QSL to his home call. Roland, F8EN, has extended his TR8CR operation from Gabon through mid-June. He is on CW only, and you can QSL via the Bureau or via F6AJA, his QSL manager. Ari, OH3KAV, will be active as OH0KA from Kokar in the Aland Islands through April 22nd, mostly FT8 and CW on HF, including 5 MHz and possibly some 6 meters. You can QSL that operation at OH3KAV. Members of the Bavarian Contest Club are QRV from VP2 Victor, the British Virgin Islands, and will continue through April 27th. They will go QRT at 1200 Zulu and take down the antennas, departing early on the 28th. They have 560 kilograms of gear in 2 oversized packages sent ahead. If you haven't worked them, it's because you're not trying. They are everywhere. Well done. PV8DX is setting up the HD8 Golf on the station on the Galapagos Islands until April 26th to be satellite and HF use, with one station doing some CW. This expedition has been a year in the planning, with meeting every 2 weeks. Various ops have had to cancel, but others have joined over this time. There are now 25, quote, passionate ops from 7 countries. Getting by language and cultural differences has been a primary objective to come up with, quote, one great DXpedition, unforgettable for all the ham community. The 7 countries are Ecuador, Brazil, the USA, Russia, Latvia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia. Most are experienced DXers and DXpeditioners, and some are brand new. There will be 8 full-time stations and a 9th one on at night times only. DX News says that XU7 Oscar by DL7BO is up and running in Cambodia, operating on the HF bands. QSL using Logbook of the World or Club Log, or direct to DL4WK. I also have an update on C5, the Gambia. F5 RAV has the C5LT call sign, and YT3PL has the C5R call sign. With them is IK8 HJC for the April 19th to May 2nd operation. They will be using CW sideband FT8 FT4 on HF, 6 and on satellite. You can QSL C5LT direct to F5 RAV and C5R to YU5R. Logs will be uploaded to Club Log. Taki JG8NQJ/JD1 is going back to the weather station at Minami Torishima for a stay of, quote, a couple of months, and should be QRV by now. He operates in his spare time there on CW and FT8. On FT8, he wants you to send a signal report, not your grid. That will help speed things up. And you can QSL to JG8NQJ, JA8CJY, or via Logbook of the World. Bonaire is being activated by PJ4CB, otherwise known as WA7RAR, until April 27th on CW and sideband, using 20 through 10 meters, some of the times from parks on the air. QSL direct to WA7RAR or through LOTW and QRZ. J87IPR Itchy is QRV from T88UW in Palau until 9 p.m. local time on April 23rd. He is also monitoring 50.313 on 6 meters and will get on there when he starts seeing openings. FG/DG3 FEH should be QRV from Puente Lagarda, Guadalupe until April 27th. Holger will have an IC 7300, 100 watts to a full-size ground plane for 20 and 15 meters. The feed point is 5 meters above ground with elevated radials. On 40 meters, it's an end-fed half-wave. He plans sideband and FT8. You can QSL to the Bureau, LOTW, and Club Log. VP9KF is QRV until April 28th by G4BKI Paul. He plans to be on HFCW only. Apparently, he does not plan to QSL through LOTW or Club Log, go QRS, so how to get a QSL from him and confirm the QSO at this point is not known, but he may give the information out soon, and when he does, you'll have it here. The most recent DX Mentor podcast episode is available this weekend. Alex, K6VHF, was the guest. Alex talked about everything from the world records that he holds to his work with SETI, his Deep Space Exploration Society work, his DX and DXpedition activities, as well as his participation in the Bouncing Signals Off of Venus project. You have to give it a listen. He's a fascinating guy. You can also check out the DX Mentor Facebook page to keep tabs on what is current and what is coming. I know that the ARRL contest sheet is read elsewhere in this podcast, and the contests that I mention are oftentimes redundant. However, there are a few contests that I have found to be especially useful for DXers who's trying to fill band slots or to get entities or zones in the log that may otherwise be difficult to get. So here's one for this weekend, and it's probably underway by the time you're listening to this. The Worldwide Holy Land DX Contest, or the WWHC, is underway. Before 2023, it was called the Holy Land Contest. This is the new name for this event over the last few years. Everyone works everyone all over the world, with QSOs from the 4X/4Z or the Israeli stations giving more points. It ends on April 19th at 2100 Zulu, so you probably still have time as you're listening to this. And if you need more details on that, you can contact me at thedxmentor@gmail.com or WA7BNM website. Until next week, this is Bill, AJ8B, saying 7 threes, and thanks to my ex-YL Karen for her love and support. I hope to hear you in the pile-ups. Have a great DX week.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, your amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air, available as a podcast on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartMedia, and Spotify.
Welcome to the 35th segment of Ham Radio History, a century of amateur radio, hams, organizations, events, inventions. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR. Our thanks go to Chris Cadella, W2PA, for allowing us to use this website in the production of these chapters. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the next chapter of Ham Radio History. Crossings 2, Ardrossan, continued. They were back out at dawn on 7 December, and with additional local help, worked all day setting up the receiving station. By nightfall at 4, all the poles were up, and the beverage wire had been strung. They continued to bury ground plates and connected a variable non-inductive resistor to complete the antenna. After a quick dinner at the hotel, they returned to hook up the receiving equipment. Everything was working so far, and just before midnight they were receiving signals from European stations, including FL in Paris, POZ in Nauen, Germany, and many more on 600 meters. The receiving equipment included a Paragon regenerative receiver with a DA2 detector, amplifier, and a 10-tube superheterodyne receiver with external beat oscillator for CW. A 60-foot wire was put up in a tree, and the incoming 600-meter signals were used to tune it up for maximum sensitivity on short waves. Around 1 a.m., they began listening on the beverage, hearing a few commercial harmonics as expected, but far fewer than in London. The paragon connected to the beverage mirrored the unplanned handshake between the two inventors aboard the Aquitania. Only a half hour into listening, they already began to hear signals unmistakably coming in from the U.S., possibly identifying one AEP and definitely one AAW on 270 meters. The signals were fluctuating between too weak to read and booming in loudly, but Godley and Pearson were elated, having achieved their primary goal on the very first night. They took a break around 2:30 to inspect the antenna and repair a wire break and a downed pole caused by the high winds. Hearing no further signals from the U.S. and rising QRN, they quit, tired but happy, at 6 a.m., after 21 hours of continuous work in the cold wind and rain. Although the weather finally cleared the following evening, 8 December, they heard no amateur signals at all. Some 600-meter signals were noticeably weaker than on the previous night, indicating that conditions were probably worse overall. CW reception was particularly hindered by harmonics of high-powered stations, especially the one at Clifton in Ireland. As the clear weather chilled further, Godley's head cold worsened. Pearson, being a Scotchman, seemed to be immune, he wrote, and no doubt would suggest that I don't drink enough of Scotland's honeydew. They closed down at 6 a.m. after a futile night of noise-filled listening. The rain returned on 9 December, and after listening for free-for-all spark signals, they switched to CW and immediately heard 1BCG very steadily around 12:50 a.m. on 230 to 235 meters, plowing right through the QRM from Clifton. His signals improved even more after adjusting the beverage. He is calling PF test and signing. "Sweetest song I have ever heard," wrote Godley excitedly in his log. He fades out for 30 seconds every 3 or 4 minutes, but always comes back strong and steady. Godley had chosen the beverage antenna after hearing the high QRN in London and abandoned plans to also erect a vertical. They tuned the beverage by running back and forth from the operating tent to the far end where the variable resistor was located. He later speculated that, since on the 9th they had optimized it on the signal from 1BCG and then left it there, this was the only wavelength for which it was ever properly adjusted. They shut down at 6 a.m. after hearing no other stations, but started again briefly just to copy MUU. Upon hearing it sending Godley's message, he was struck by the reality that they were indeed making history. Suddenly feeling held back, he wrote, "I would give a year of my life for a 1 kW tube transmitter, aerial, license. To be forced to listen to a Yankee ham and only listen is a hard blow." The New York Times reported the news on 10 December without detail, saying that between 15,000 and 20,000 amateur radio stations in the United States are taking part. Godley wired Corsi with the report of hearing 1BCG. Greatly impressed by the quality of his signal, he and Pearson speculated about what equipment that station could possibly be using, with Pearson unable to believe it was less than 1 kW. The signals had been so unusually steady in frequency that he was able to take advantage of resonance in the headphones to boost its readability, not knowing that was exactly what its designers had hoped for. So good was the signal that Godley was able to detect an operator change, presumably by changes in fist, the particular style with which each operator sends Morse code. He decided to wire Armstrong directly to suggest he try sending a message the following night, but Godley's message was mishandled and came through as send MGES. So the following night, with signals coming in very well, instead of sending actual messages, 1BCG comically kept sending MGES over and over all night long through fading and static, and reflected in Godley's running log annotated with timestamps. They heard and identified several other stations on both CW and Spark that night, including many who were calling other stations. 9ZG was recognized by Fist, though he was not heard to sign his call. After a productive night of listening and logging, they closed down at 6:50 a.m. to copy MUU. Godley cabled one BCG with a copy of his note to Corsi. He imagined the gang there rejoicing at their success as he and Pearson marveled at the performance of one BCG, the highlight of the test and steadily the strongest, most constantly copyable signal. Many other stations were heard that night but not identified, sometimes simply because they failed to sign their calls while making local contacts, a practice Godley made a point of condemning. Between 4:30 and 6 a.m., there were sometimes so many stations coming through at Ardrossan that the QRM made copying difficult. It reminded him of familiar conditions around New York, but with much weaker signals. The next night, Monday, 12 December, they again heard lots of weak signals and identified many from the 1st and 2nd District on Spark, CW, or ICW. ICW is interrupted CW, a way of modulating or pulsing a straight or undamped CW signal to make it audible in a receiver having no beat oscillator. Everything faded out completely by around 4 a.m. On Tuesday, signals had been coming through in London as well, and Corsi radioed ARRL headquarters with many your stations heard by British amateurs. Details later. Godley and Pearson, having been awake for 24 hours, overslept and did not begin operating until 1:30 a.m. that night. Although the weather was clear, on-air conditions were poor, and they heard no identifiable signals from the U.S. On 13 December and into the 14th, they slept late again. According to a letter from Corsi, U.S. stations had been heard in London in the early morning on modest equipment, but mostly hearing QRM from harmonics and commercial stations. It was overcast and still quite cold and windy. The oil heater was not working well, so they moved it under the operating table. They then arranged the equipment to permit them to crouch down near the heater with their heads just above the table, so that the greatest possible portion of our bodies was exposed to what little heat was radiated by the stove. At one point, they both fell asleep against the desk. As they slept, the stove began to smoke. Godley awoke suddenly, startling Pearson, who gave him a strange look. Some of the papers, along with the underside of the table, had turned black, and so had the portion of Godley's face that had lain across a crack in the table. After another disappointing night of hearing no signals, they quit at 3:10 a.m., very tired and sleepy, both greatly in need of rest. At times they were so tired it was difficult to go outside to check the antenna. The static, the harmonic QRM, the cold and wet were hard to endure. Godley was also battling a worsening head cold that taxed his energy. Fearing pneumonia, he considered quitting, but was inspired to continue by Pearson's operating ability and enthusiasm. And, of course, the signals coming through kept them both excited and interested. A quick break for identification purposes. You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. Wednesday, 14 December into Thursday, the weather was finally beginning to warm just a bit, but light static, commercial stations, and harmonics were all they heard, with very few signals of any kind coming through. They quit early again at 4:30 a.m. The following day, they were up all day getting photos of setup and also had several visitors, one of whom voiced incredulous disbelief upon being told where the various signals were coming in from. "I know a bit of American swank when I see it," he said. With much worse static than that night, they shut down at 4:40 on Friday morning after another session without hearing any U.S. signals at all. Godley originally intended to return home by Christmas to spend it with his family, but once he decided to operate from Scotland, he realized it would not be possible. He could not get back to Southampton in time to catch the Aquitania on 17 December due to the schedule they had set up and the extra travel involved. So before going north, he had booked himself on the Olympic, scheduled to sail on the 21st. Now he could use the extra time to pay proper respects to the various men who had been of great assistance, to get his equipment through customs and retrieve his deposit. He'd have to make it to London by Monday the 19th in order for this new schedule to work out. So on Friday afternoon, he and Pearson decided to forego another night of listening in favor of dismantling the station. That way Godley could return the equipment he had borrowed in Glasgow before everything closed down there, as it normally did at noon on Saturday. By early Friday evening, everything had been packed up, and later that night they were back in Ardrossan, ready to board the train to Glasgow in the morning. Besides the schedule advantages, they later were glad they had quit when they did, because the tail end of a cyclone hit Scotland that night, bringing higher winds than at any time during the operation. The same storm had flooded London and battered the Olympic on her way in, causing 2 deaths aboard and damaging equipment. Godley speculated that the storm might have actually played a part in the success of the tests. It had originated in the Gulf of Mexico, proceeded up the east coast of North America, crossed the Atlantic, and brushed by the British Isles before going on to Norway. That meant the storm had been located between their receiving station and the U.S. East Coast during the time when they had heard the largest number of signals. The editor of the popular British science magazine Conquest sent Paul Godley a poem during the test that neatly summarized his various trials. If our climate is ungodly, if the weather seems to pall, if our static strikes you oddly, if you hear no sigs at all, if you get harmonics down the scale as far as tuners go, if the dialect of Scotland doesn't sound like Ohio, if 20,000 hard-boiled hams are waiting on your word, if but the thought of hearing them seems very near absurd, if in the chilly morning hours the faintest sigs come through, we'd like to hear about it, if it's all the same to you. Included in this material are quotes from the following: Amateurs Send Radio Far, The New York Times, December 20, 1921. With our thanks to Chris Cadella, W2PA, for granting us permission to use his website, Ham Radio History, A Century of Amateur Radio, Ham's Organizations, Events, Inventions, in the preparation of this segment, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. One of the basic aspects of being human and growing up is the process of learning. From a young age, we explore our environment, play with others, have fun, fall over and bruise our knees, get up and try again. The playing aspect of this is often discussed as a way to keep things interesting. We add a competition element as an added incentive, so much so that we formulate it into global competitions and call it sport. As a species, it might surprise you that we spend about 1% of all gross domestic product on sport, compared to science, which is about 2% of global GDP. To give you some context, agriculture accounts for about 4%, manufacturing is 15%, industry is about 26%, and services account for roughly 62%. If you notice that this is more than 100%, take it up with the World Bank. I'm a radio amateur, not an economist. Over the years, I've explored different aspects of our chosen hobby of amateur radio. Time and again, I return to experimentation, learning, and having fun. Now, I absolutely concede that my idea of fun and yours might not match. My GDP side quest is likely evidence of this, but in my opinion, this embodies the range of how we as a disparate community interact and exchange ideas, across the ionosphere and closer to home, using what we can all agree on is pretty close to magic. So what is my point? Fair question. Having fun and learning. If you've ever had the opportunity to listen to aviation radio, and I'd encourage you to, the YouTube channel VAS Aviation is a great place to start. Comes with maps, explanations, and subtitles. You'll discover that the complex domain of aviation communication is a dynamic environment where miscommunication matters and often has severe consequences. It's not all incidents and accidents, though. If you look for air traffic control legend Kennedy Steve, you'll come across some of the funniest exchanges captured on ATC frequencies, all the while staying professional. So how does this relate to amateur radio and you? Well, at the moment, we have a few types of exchanges where we can practice our skills. The most obvious one is a thing we call contesting, a scored and rule-bound activity where you're expected to exchange information and are declared the winner in a category. It's a little like sport, and some have attempted to rephrase amateur radio contesting into a field that they're calling radio sport. I have mixed feelings about this because there isn't much in the way of spectator activity associated with this. Another exchange is calling for DX contacts, sharing an exchange across distance, attempting to contact as many countries as possible, with the prize being membership into the fabled DXCC, the century club that acknowledges your prowess in making contact with 100 countries. The most common exchange is the net or discussion group. It can be formal, like the weekly F-Trip I've been hosting since 2011, or it can be ad hoc, one amateur chatting to another, sparking spontaneous discussion among several stations on frequency. We also do things like radio direction finding. Someone sets up a transmitter and everyone playing tries to find the source as quickly as possible. First one to find it wins. It made me wonder if there are other things we might come up with. Has anyone played chess across HF? Or, if you want to involve a larger group, what about playing bingo or a game of trivia? Anyone considered an MMORPG or massively multiplayer online role-playing game? The point being that we can play games, have fun, and learn in an environment where there are many factors affecting your ability to communicate, so we can all get better at keying the microphone and getting the message to the intended recipient. While we're having fun, nobody said that this needs to be a voice activity. An FT8 session could well be coerced into transmitting chess moves, and nobody said that you have to do FT8 on the same frequency that WSJTX is using. So what games can you come up with and learn from? I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima Alpha Bravo.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Bruce Page, KK5DO, is here now with this week's AMSAT report. Bruce?
Thanks, John. As we have a few recently launched satellites high in the sky, here's a quick update. Hades R, or SO-124, is operational. Hades ICM is getting close. Satellite is being checked out, and as soon as it is fully functional and the final KEPs are released, the satellite will be open for use. All the Tevel 2 satellites 1 through 9 are not operational yet. AO-123 repeater was active up to April 8th and then again on April 12th. This could be due to running experiments on a secondary payload. We're about 2 months away from field day, and it will be great if most of these satellites are fully operational. It will make for a wonderful satellite field day and allow many ARRL clubs to get their bonus points more easily. If you are an ARRL member, be sure to take a look at the April 2025 issue of QST on pages 35 and 36. There's an article on OpenGD77 to flash the firmware on some models of Radio Diddy, Bofang, and TYT radios. It has successfully been used on an Anytone 878 UV2 Plus. This firmware upgrade invalidates all FCC certifications. Be sure to back up the current firmware so you will be able to restore the radio to original functionality. The firmware will allow screens that show polar view graphic, satellite individual predictions, a satellite alarm, and ability to upload KEPs to the radio. Thanks to QST for this story and David WA1EAW. This is Bruce Page, KK5DO. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Bruce, for that report. Amateur radio public information volunteers and club leaders are invited to join members of the ARRL Public Relations Committee for a 2025 ARRL Field Day Public Relations Workshop scheduled for Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025 at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Registration is required. The event will cover how to build social media engagement, press releases, and media strategy, getting a proclamation from local officials, building your club's visual asset library, and much more. Attendees will have a chance to get questions answered by veteran PR experts from around the ham community. A replay of the workshop will be posted for those who cannot participate live.
It is time for this week's edition of the Propagation Forecast and Solar Weather Report. SpaceWeather.com reports a cannibal coronal mass ejection on April 15 sparked geomagnetic storms. On April 16, the storm became severe with northern lights sighted as far south as France. The storm is subsiding now to a category G1 or G2, which could still produce high-latitude auroras. Although regions AR4062 and AR4064 have been relatively quiet, they are more structurally complex than anticipated. They will maintain a 60% chance for R1 or 2 flare activity through April 19. Chances for X-class flare activity remain around 10. Unsettled to active levels are expected on April 18, followed by quiet to unsettled conditions on April 19. Solar activity is expected to be at moderate to high levels on April 27 to May 10 with the return of region AR4055. Low to moderate levels are expected for the remainder of the outlook period. Unsettled to active levels are expected on April 18, April 22 and 23, and on May 3 and 4. Moderate storm levels are expected again on May 2 due to recurrent coronal hole high-speed stream influences. Minor storm levels are expected on May 1 and May 5 and 6, all due to recurrent coronal hole high-speed stream activity. The predicted planetary A index for April 19 to the 25th will have a mean of 11.6. The predicted planetary K index will have a mean of 3.4. 10.7 centimeter flux will have a mean of 153.6. For more information concerning radio propagation, visit the ARRL Technical Information Service, read What the Numbers Mean, a quick guide to HF propagation using solar indices, and check out the propagation page of Karl Lewetzelschwab, K9LA. For customizable propagation charts, visit the VOCAP Online for Ham Radio website.
In radio sport this week, a lot of great contests. April 18th and the 19th, the Worldwide Holy Land Contest, that's CW and phone. On April 19th, the ES Open HF Championship, CW and phone. April 19th as well, the QRP to the field, CW phone. April 19th to the 20th, the CQ-MMDX Contest, that's CW. Also on April 19th through the 20th, the Nebraska QSO Party, CW phone and digital, and the Michigan QSO Party, CW and phone, and the EAQRP CW contest, that is CW, and the Ontario QSO Party, CW and phone. April 20th through the 21st, the Run for the Bacon QRP contest, that's CW. April 21st, the 7DARC Easter contest, CW and phone there. April 22nd through the 23rd, the 222 MHz Spring Sprint, CW phone and digital. And on April 24th, the RSGB 80-meter Club Championship, that is digital as well. Remember to visit the ARRL contest calendar for more events and information. Upcoming section, state, and division conventions, April 25th through the 27th. It's the Big Bear Ham Escape hosting the ARRL Orange Section Convention. That's in Big Bear Lake, California. On April 26th, the Delmarva Amateur Radio and Electronics Expo hosting the ARRL Delaware State Convention. That's in Georgetown, Delaware. April 26th, the Spokane Ham Fest hosting the ARRL Washington State Convention. That's in Spokane Valley, Washington. And on May 4th, the Warminster Amateur Radio Club Annual Ham Fest hosting the ARRL Eastern Pennsylvania Section Convention. That's in Bristol, Pennsylvania. And don't forget to search the ARRL Ham Fest and Convention database to find events in your area.
Produced by amateurs for amateurs and originating from Albany, New York, you're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio.
A new Youth on the Air camp is set for July. The inaugural Youth on the Air Yoda Junior Camp for the Americas has been scheduled for July 25th through the 27th, 2025. That camp will be held at the National Voice of America Museum of Broadcasting in Westchester, Ohio. The camper application period is now open until June 1st at https youthontheair.org/jrcamper-apply. Licensed amateur radio operators under the age of 15 are eligible to attend, while the sub-regional camp is designed for participants from the USA. Others may also apply. That camp is a miniature version of the week-long region-wide camps for young hams at ages 15 through 25. The cost for each person, camper and parent, is $100. Transportation to and from Cincinnati, though, is not included. Funding for the Yoda Junior USA 2025 camp is provided by a grant from Amateur Radio Digital Communications, ARDC. For additional information, please visit youthontheair.org.
Broadcast audio processing company Orban Labs has donated an Optimod 9100B AM processor signed by company founder Bob Orban to ARRL in support of this year's annual auction. The donation was made at the annual National Association of Broadcasters Convention. Orban Labs has set the standard for audio processing in broadcast industry for 50 years. Its donation will be used to raise funds in support of ARRL's programs in amateur radio at the annual auction. Company founder Bob Orban was on hand to sign the cover plate, which makes this unique, vintage, and fully functional item a valuable collector's piece. Orban Labs co-owner Mike Pappas, W9CN, organized this generous donation, which was accepted on behalf of ARRL by Pacific Division Director Anthony Marchin, W7XM.
ARRL volunteers in the Iowa section have cause to celebrate. Their state-local advocacy work on behalf of amateur radio has resulted in an exception to the state's hands-free law that covers ham operators. John Ross, KD8IDJ, is here with all the details.
Iowa Senate Bill File 22, a bill addressing distracted driving, had been in development since 2020. Former ARRL Section Manager Leila Garner, WA0UIG, and Iowa Section State Government Liaison Alan Eckerson, WB0OAV, played a crucial role in fostering and maintaining key legislative relationships. Over the course of 5 years, they navigated the legislative process to ensure the continued exemption for amateur radio operators. Being proactive about sharing the good work amateur radio operators do was key. We presented a carefully crafted exemption proposal backed by evidence of our contributions as a radio service, said Garner. The texting bill passed the Iowa Senate with a vote of 47-1 on March 18, 2025, and the Iowa House passed it on March 26, 2025, with a vote of 54-11. On April 2, 2025, it was signed by Governor Kim Reynolds and goes into effect July 1, 2025. The process encouraged Eckerson. Every legislator I spoke with appreciated the public service that licensed amateur radio provides. They also acknowledged that the responsibility demonstrated by amateur radios was great, and I was impressed by their willingness to exempt amateur radio from the texting bill, and was so humbled that we have a duty to preserve this awesome reputation. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
The COVID-19 pandemic and political opposition to the measure ground the bill to a halt, but the ARRL Iowa section volunteers continue to engage in the process and ensure that amateur radio is represented as the legislature finally took the bill back up. The final language of the bill included the provisions of the subsection do not apply to a person using a two-way radio transmitter or a receiver who's licensed with the FCC in amateur radio service.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a direct download on our website at www.twiar.net.
NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams, KD5PLB, participated in a news conference on Monday, March 31, at Johnson Space Center in Houston. Afterwards, they spent hours conducting short interviews with reporters from around the world, describing their mission to test Boeing's Starliner spacecraft, which launched on June 5th for a planned 10 days. After Starliner separated from the Atlas V rocket, Williams and Wilmore performed several maneuvering tests and put the vehicle through its paces. Starliner performed exceptionally well during the initial test. The most challenging part of the mission, which would stress Starliner's handling capabilities, would come as it approached the orbiting laboratory, and that's when the trouble started as several thrusters began to fail. Wilmore had to take manual control of the vehicle, but even more thruster failures then ensued. Essentially, Wilmore could not fully control Starliner any longer. Just as thrusters were needed to control the vehicle during the docking maneuver, they were also necessary to position Starliner for its deorbit burn and re-entry to Earth's atmosphere. So Wilmore had to contemplate whether it was riskier to approach the space station or try to fly it back to Earth. Wilmore said, "I knew that Mission Control was working really hard to be able to keep communications with us, and then to be able to send commands. We were both thinking, what if we lose communication with the ground? What do heroes look like? Well, heroes put their tank on, and they run into a fiery building and pull people out of it. That's a hero. Heroes also sit in their cubicle for decades, studying their systems, knowing their systems front and back, and when there's no time to assess a situation, to go and talk to people, but ask, what do you think? They know their systems so well they come up with a plan on the fly, and that's a hero, and there were several of them in Mission Control," said Wilmore.
The Zero Retries newsletter, which offers readers articles on technology and innovation in ham radio, is branching out to host its first digital conference later this year. It will be held in Washington State. September will be a big month for technology and innovation in amateur radio, and at the inaugural Zero Retries digital conference, many of the articles readers have enjoyed in the newsletter will come to life. Those attending can expect to hear about the IP400 networking project and see demonstrations of the M17 digital voice and data system and the MMDVM TNC data system. Conference manager Tina Stroh, KD7WSF, expects to put out requests for presenters very soon and will make a sign-up sheet available online. The conference will be held on September 13th at the Edward D. Hansen Conference Center in Everett, Washington. The Hansen Conference Center will be transformed into a kind of epicenter of digital innovation at that time. The Zero Retries Conference is taking place just as GRCCon 2025 wraps up. GRCCon is the annual convention for the GNU Radio project and community. That conference runs from Monday, September 8th through Friday, September 12th. Although the two events share the same venue, they are not connected to one another. Invitations to the Zero Retries Conference are expected to be out shortly.
Several threads have come together pointing to a new breed of space-oriented individuals who may be attracted to amateur radio. Exploding interest in inexpensive small-board computers, satellite-specific firmware for handhelds, 3D printed parts for satellite antennas and soda can-sized satellites, and makers using small-board computers. According to Wikipedia, the maker culture is a contemporary subculture representing a technology-based extension of do-it-yourself culture that intersects with hardware-oriented parts of hacker culture and revels in the creation of new devices as well as tinkering with existing ones. Taken as a whole, this points in the direction from which new hams, especially students and young adults, may arise. This article is the first of a series about makers as potential recruits for amateur radio clubs. To learn more about makers, simply go to YouTube. YouTube is an abundant source of maker videos, with some produced by satellite-oriented radio amateurs and others. We'll be covering more topics about makers and means of attracting them to amateur radio clubs in upcoming newscasts, or follow recent issues of the AMSAT News Weekly Bulletin.
According to our education partner at ARIS, the Framinauts are back on Earth after a groundbreaking mission and ham radio event. The ARIS STEM contest team's submission deadlines for participants to submit their contest entries was April 17, 2025. More than 110 STEM team submissions were received, along with 1,100 general submissions to the gallery. Once contest submissions are complete, ARIS will share when the gallery images are live. That is then your opportunity to start sharing your personal image SSTV captures on social media. As with any experiment, there are many lessons learned. ARIS seeks feedback from participants. A shortwave listener, Ryszard Kolowski, on April 7, 2025, posted a professional quality frame collection of photos received during the Fram to Ham SSTV experiment. For details, visit framtoham.com. Kowalski has been a member of AMSAT since January 21st, 2020.
An article in ARRL's QST magazine, April 2025, pages 35 and 36, provides an overview of an available open-source firmware for handheld radios. According to the article, the free firmware can provide some models of analog FM and DMR-capable radios with satellite capability, including screens showing polar view graphic, satellite individual predictions, a satellite alarm, and the ability to upload KEPS data into the radio. Doppler tuning and AOS and LOS information were mentioned in the QST article. Several YouTube videos about the firmware are live, including how to create a code plug for programming a handheld with GD77 firmware. This unique firmware was introduced several years ago. The firmware is now available in use in some models of Radiolity, Baofeng, and TYT radios, and have successfully used on the Anytone 878 UV2 Plus handheld. A GD77 user guide is also available on GitHub. The developer's site includes this caution statement: firmware license forbids any form of commercial use of the firmware binary or source code. Installing the firmware onto the radio will invalidate all FCC certifications and those of other countries' licensing bodies. However, it is usually possible to back up and restore the original firmware.
It's time for AMSAT satellite shorts from all over, and we begin this week with an announcement that CatSat is now ready for microwave testing and QSOs. CatSat successfully demonstrated the capability to act as a linear transponder satellite for the first time on the morning of April 11. In this mode of operation, the satellite receives signals sent from the ground at 5.663 GHz and retransmits them back to Earth at 10.47 GHz. During the past, team members tracked the satellite and confirmed the presence of the retransmitted signal at 10.47. Next up, a short from SpaceX, whose static fired the Super Heavy Booster 14 that had previously flown and returned on flight number 7, ahead of Starship Flight 9, with 29 of its 33 engines being flight-proven. This will be the first reuse for the Starship system. And this final short this week is all about the cover story for the May 2025 issue of QST Magazine, where there's an article beginning on page 55 about NASA on the Air, a collaboration of 12 amateur radio clubs at NASA facilities across the country, from California to Florida. Club stations operate primarily by NASA staff members who happen to be licensed amateurs, commemorate special events in space history, and with special operations on the ham bands.
The 2024 CAS Award winners have been announced. These honor DXers who worked the greatest number of different stations during a D-expedition. The single-operator CAS Award winner is Jan Hoots Wigerson, SP9-FIH, for working 15,396 unique stations during his 14-day, one-man A52P D-expedition to Bhutan. The PX0FF team has won the 2024 Unlimited CAS Awards for working 34,336 unique stations during their 28-day operation from Fernanda de Noronha, a Brazilian archipelago in the South Pacific. The CAS Awards, presented annually, are sponsored by the Club Log DX Lab and the Northern California DX Club. These awards honor the wisdom and spirit of UH Cassidy, WA6AUD Silent Key, who coined the expression, DX is.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
The International Amateur Radio Union Centennial QSO Party began at 0000 UTC on Saturday, April 12th, and ends at 2359 UTC on Sunday, April 20th. The CQP encompasses World Amateur Radio Day on Friday, April 18, 2025. This event celebrates 100 years of the International Amateur Radio Union promoting the interests of amateur radio worldwide, seeking to protect and enhance our spectrum privileges. Amateur radio operators worldwide are encouraged to be active on the air. Based only on QSOs uploaded to LOTW, QCell confirmations are not required. A website to be published later in the year will track participants' accumulated contact points and provide participation certificates for download. ARRL ham radio open house events are happening around the world. They are an opportunity for clubs to welcome the public into their stations and show off what ham radio has to offer. Find an event near you at www.arrl.org/open-house.
The Federal Communications Commission is gearing up to potentially relax radio emission restrictions for Starlink. SpaceX has been lobbying to revise the rules, calling them outdated and detrimental to its satellite internet service. On Friday, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr previewed the agency's agenda for this month, saying one item will seek to unleash even faster and more robust broadband services from space. Specifically, we will look to update our rules in the frequencies commonly known by satellite aficionados as the Ka and Ku bands, he said. Although Starlink wasn't named, the satellite internet service uses both the Ka and Ku radio bands to transmit data. Carr described the radio bands as workhorse satellite frequencies that support the next generation of mega constellations in low Earth orbit. Unfortunately, new innovations have been held back by the FCC's technical rules that we adopted 30 years ago, he added. Power limits developed in the 1990s to protect geostationary satellite systems from interference continue to restrict the performance of non-geostationary satellite systems, even though advancements in sharing technology arguably make the rules of the past no longer necessary. In response, Carr said the FCC will vote to take a fresh look at the decades-old spectrum sharing regime between geostationary and non-geostationary satellite systems in these spectrum bands. Previous FCC Chair Jessica Rosenworcel also called for updating older satellite rules to promote competition, but Carr's statement appears to be a win for SpaceX as well. The company has been urging the FCC to update a specific rule concerning the equivalent power flux density limits, which regulate the amount of energy a satellite can transmit to and from ground equipment. Last August, SpaceX asked the Commission to change the outdated rules. The 25-year-old regulations constrain next-generation satellite services and protect radio spectrum access for older geostationary satellites at the expense of low Earth orbiting systems like Starlink, the company alleged. The revisions would increase satellite coverage and service quality, ensuring that all Americans can enjoy high-speed, low-latency broadband, SpaceX said at the time. They would enhance the consumer's choice by allowing next-generation satellite operators to provide an even more competitive option in the market. Last month, the company also sent another letter to the FCC, which asked for a waiver to the power limit rules as part of the company's proposal to upgrade the Starlink constellation with gigabit speeds. The FCC originally created the rules to protect satellite providers from interference, but SpaceX says it can operate in excess of the current EPFD downlink limits while still protecting geostationary orbit operations in the United States from harmful interference. Still, SpaceX's letter notes that legacy geostationary orbit operators Dish Network, Viasat, and Eutelsat OneWeb opposes SpaceX's request to waive outdated EPFD downlink limits for its operations in the United States. So the FCC's push to revise the rules will likely face opposition from SpaceX's rivals. Last month, SpaceX also received a waiver from the FCC related to radio emissions rules, but for the company's cellular Starlink service for cellular phones.
Congratulations to Nathaniel Frizzle, W2NAF, and Gwyn Griffiths, G3ZIL, whose studies of ionospheric propagation with Ham Radio Science Citizen Investigation, or Ham SCI, has been honored by the Radio Society of Great Britain. The Les Barkley Memorial Award has been given to Nathaniel for Ham SCI's contributions in elevating amateur radio-based citizen science to a higher profile. The award is being given to him by the RSGB Propagation Studies Committee. He is the founder of Ham SCI. Gwynn is the author of a series of articles published in several issues of RSGB magazine, Radcom, in 2024. She has been recognized through the Society's Wortley Talbot Trophy, which recognizes in particular her article, Height of Reflections at HF, that appeared in the August 2024 magazine issue. She is a longtime member of the Ham SCI community.
Ford Motor Company has filed a patent for a new technology designed to support AM radio and electric vehicles through a hybrid solution, as first reported by the website Ford Authority. According to Ford Authority's Brett Foote, Ford filed the patent in 2023 and it was published on March 27th. Radio World magazine has reached out to Ford for further comment on its plans for the technology. The core idea behind the system's concept is to avoid being bound to a single radio tuner. Instead, Ford describes a communication system that relies on a remote vehicle entertainment server to deliver content. Specifically, the communication system generally includes at least one tuner, the patent says. However, a tuner is not provided for a designated radio transmission medium, such as an AM tuner for receiving the AM frequency band. Ford also describes a digital AM radio module capable of obtaining content for a single station from multiple sources, including cellular networks, over-the-air broadcast, and V2X vehicle-to-everything communication. The patent outlines what happens when a tuner is unresponsive to a first radio transmission medium. In such cases, the vehicle sends a radio content request to a remote server, which then receives the station content from a source and stores it in a staging memory before transmitting it to the vehicle. This would likely involve streaming the station's live feed. The system can switch sources dynamically if the quality of the content from the first source degrades. Ford Authority noted that AM functionality was removed from the 2023 edition of the F-150 Lightning, despite having been previously standard. Its decision was based on the concern that the drivetrains of electric vehicles interfere with AM radio. However, following public and regulatory pressure, Ford restored AM radio to its 2023 EVs and included it in its 2024 lineup. Now, Ford Authority reports, this new patent presents a potential long-term solution to mitigate AM radio interference in future EVs while still offering access to AM content.
The possibilities are endless in amateur radio, and so are the new books in the newest collection on the shelves of the Great Falls Public Library and other public libraries in Montana. The books were donated by the Great Falls Masonic Amateur Radio Club, which received a grant from the ARRL to provide library patrons with study guides for the Technician, General, and Amateur Extra exams administered by the FCC. John Ross, KD7HKF, the club's vice president, said the Great Falls Library's bookmobile will also carry a set of books. The ARRL grant has also funded collections of books for Montana's Cascade Library, Fairfield Library, and the library at the Malmstrom Air Force Base. Meanwhile, the library and the club have agreed that ham radio orientation sessions will be held at the Great Falls Library if enough community members are inspired to learn even more. The relationship between amateur radio clubs and libraries in the United States is a strong one. Previous such gifts of books have occurred at other libraries around the United States, including the Jackson Amateur Radio Club, which donated books last year to the Madison County Public Library System in Mississippi, and the Cowley County Amateur Radio Club, which made a similar donation earlier this year to the Arkansas City Public Library.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
United Airlines said the Federal Aviation Administration has approved its first Starlink-equipped aircraft type, and that the first commercial flight is planned for May. The Chicago-based airline plans to add high-speed Wi-Fi technology to around 40 regional jets per month and expects all 300 planes of that type will be completed by the end of next year. United said it will work with Elon Musk's Starlink to secure FAA approval to install Starlink on more of its 16 United aircraft models. Starlink Wi-Fi service will be eventually available on all of its flights. Last year, United signed a deal with Starlink to provide in-flight internet service across its entire fleet of over 1,000 aircraft over the next several years. Starlink, a unit of SpaceX, has deals with multiple airlines to provide in-flight internet service as it seeks to expand its reach beyond consumers and households in rural areas around the world with little or no internet access.
And to wrap things up for us this week, we have this story. A group known as the Tropical Trekkers has been celebrating the anniversary of a 10-mile stretch of the Florida Scenic Trail since it was opened to hikers 7 years ago. With mobile phones in hand, the organizers have traditionally tracked the celebration's hikers with as much accuracy as intermittent cellular service would allow. That is until this year. In late March, 7 amateur radio operators were dispatched to checkpoints every 3 or so miles along the trail and used VHF simplex to ensure that no hikers became lost, injured, or in need of assistance during this annual event. Mike Gormley, WA8VEC, a longtime trail supporter, said that the presence of radio was a natural fit for the trail event, and he was relieved when his offer to bring a team of volunteers was accepted. Mike has known the needs of the trail life well. For years, he has been known as Water Boy for his regular placement and replenishment of fresh water jugs along a 30-mile stretch of the trail during hiking season. So far this year, he has already distributed 195 gallons. He also volunteers with the Tropical Trekkers as his chapter of the Florida Trail Association to help with the physical maintenance of the 70 miles of trail. 9 months before this year's event, Mike and his team of radio volunteers, some of whom are also part of ARES or Activate Parks on the Air, started developing written forms and a protocol for tracking the hikers' whereabouts. On the day of the hike, they even provided return shuttle service for those who finished at the far end of the trail. This is not the journey's end, however. The team has been invited back and is already planning for next year. Mike said that perhaps next time they'll make use of WinLink too.
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77@gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon. This Week in Amateur Radio is heard around the world on amateur radio repeater systems, streaming on the internet, or on great low-power FM broadcast stations like WGXC-FM, part of the Wave Farm, on 90.7 MHz in Akron, New York, serving Greene County and the southern regions of New York's Capital District. Many of the news and information items heard in this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the Shortwave Listening Post, the Federal Communications Commission, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the International Telecommunications Union, the 425DX News, Parks on the Air and the Soda Reflector, and various news sources on the Internet.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you would like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and all our news team around the world, this is Will Rogers, K5WLR in Fayetteville, Arkansas, wishing you 73.